right, so good morning.
Good morning.
Jumping back into the Revelation. This week we're coming into chapter 17. We have finished the seals and the trumpets, and last week we finished the bowl judgments. And we're now headed into a section that is, again, not chronological. This is kind of backing up and looking at this thing called Babylon. We'll see that unfold here. But some of this is happening prior to the bowl. Some of it is happening early in the tribulation period. So just understand this is not right after the bowl judgments, okay? The seventh bowl is really leading into the second coming of Christ. So this is jumping back, and now it's kind of laying out some kind of a different perspective on some of the same time frame. So to set the stage for that, again, since Ben is here, we're going to have Ben read chapter 17 for us, and then we'll work our way through that. So if you would.
Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute, who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers of the earth have become drunk." And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery: Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. When I saw her, I marveled greatly. But the angel said to me, "Why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with the 7 heads and the 10 horns that carries her. The beast that you saw was and is not, and is about to rise from the bottomless pit to go to destruction. And the dwellers on earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will marvel to see the beast, because it was and is not and is to come. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. They are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. One is, the other has not yet come. And when he does come, he must remain only a little while. As for the beast that was and is not, it is an 8th, but it belongs to the 7, and it goes to destruction. And the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour, together with the beast. These are of one mind, and they hand over their power and authority to the beast. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for he is the Lord of lords and King of kings. And those with him are called and chosen and faithful. And the angel said to me, "The waters that you saw, where the prostitute is seated, are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. And the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute. They will make her desolate and naked, and devour her flesh, and burn her up with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose by being of one mind, and handing over their royal power to the beast, until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman that you saw is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth."
Thank you. So let's kind of just work our way through this. You've got a question sheet. I really wrestled with this section. It's really 17 and 18 together is what we are looking at. And I was explaining to Brenda, just like, okay, so there's this aspect, and then there's this, and da-da-da-da. And I could tell about 5 minutes in, she's like, you know what? So we're gonna really try to kind of unpack characters of the story to start with. And so we'll work our way through, and hopefully this will make some sense when we're done. I think it will, but Lord, please help us to do that. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me. So this is clearly one of the 7 angels that we have just looked at in chapter 16. He's now come to John, and he says, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute." So one of the questions on your sheet is, who or what is this great prostitute? It's really a major key to understanding this passage is getting that. And so I'm going to establish that question now, but it will take us quite some time to unfold that answer. So have that kind of in your mind as we go through these. Who is seated on many waters? Question, why is she seated on many waters? Or you might also say, what are the many waters? Or, that kind of thing. What's going on there? Well, in Revelation 17:15, we just read it, it says, "And the angel said to me, the waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes, nations and languages." So we're very clearly told what those waters represent. The waters are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. Why is she seated? Because seated is always the position of authority. A king sits on a throne. God is seated on his throne. Jesus is seated at the right hand of the Father. Seated is always a representative or way of communicating authority. So what you see here is she has authority over the people of the world. That's really what's being depicted when it says she's seated on many waters. The many waters are all the people of the world, and she has some authority over them. So that would be the answer to that. If we keep moving, it says, with whom, so this is the prostitute, right? With whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of her sexual immorality, the dwellers on earth have become drunk. Why are the kings of the earth and the dwellers on earth said to have committed sexual immorality with her? So there's some imagery going on here, and it's describing that in the context of sexual immorality, and she's called a prostitute, obviously, building into that imagery. So why is that being stated that way? I want to establish a lot of these questions, and then we just kind of keep working our way through and pull answers back up and plug them in. So now this angel, one of the 7 angels of the 7 bowls, and he, that angel, carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw. So John is about to see this revelation, or this, not revelation, this vision. It's in this wilderness area. It is a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. So the prostitute, the woman, is seated on a scarlet beast. The scarlet beast is full of blasphemous names, and the scarlet beast has the 7 heads and 10 horns. Which then the question is, what is this scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns? What is that? What is that representing in this vision? So if we look at Revelation 13, going back several months ago, you'll remember we saw this. It says, "And I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns, and blasphemous names on its heads. Very familiar, right? We just read that. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard, its feet like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And to it the dragon gave his power and his throne and his great authority. So we know that this beast is not Satan, because the Satan has been described in chapter 12 as the dragon. And the dragon here in chapter 13 is giving his power to the beast. When we went through this section, we went back and looked at Daniel, and Daniel's describing these 4 beasts, and it's the same 4 listed here, which is the leopard, the bear, and the lion. There's also in Daniel, there's a 4th one, which is just a great and dreadful beast, which is the beast itself here. And we identified him at that time, this great beast, the one with 7 heads and 10 horns. The dragon's described that way, by the way. The difference is, if you'll remember, is the crowns were on the heads of the dragon, but the crowns are on the horns of the beast. And those crowns represented authority. So Satan, as the dragon, who had 7 crowns on 7 heads, representing that he had authority over all the kingdoms of the world up through that point, and through all of time. And this is the crowns are on the horns, which would represent the kings of that time frame, not all of human history, but just right then. So we identified this beast in chapter 13 as the Antichrist. The Antichrist is an actual person, but he is also the singular leader of the entire world. So we see him spoken of as a human being or as a person, but we also see him represented as a government or a structure. So he's referred to kind of both ways. So when we get to chapter 17, and it says there's this scarlet beast full of blasphemous names with 7 heads and 10 horns, there's no talk about crowns, so we don't have that as a clue, but this is a clear enough indication of who this is. It is the Antichrist and his government. So it's a key to make sure that we understand the Antichrist and the government are one and the same. You know, he's a monarch, you know, he's an emperor, he is the sovereign over all. Whatever he says is the way it is. There is no separating him from his government, but he is an individual person. So as we keep moving through this and get to verse 4, back to our main text here in Revelation 17, the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls. It's simply a representation that this harlot or prostitute, the woman who is riding this beast, has great wealth. That's really what's being described there. Gold and jewels and pearls. Holding in her hand a golden cup full of abomination and the impurities of her sexual immorality. So again, gold cup, more of this wealth. But something interesting here, in ancient times when they would have these false religious systems, very often I know we've talked about this before, there was these false religions, and they would have priestess women in their temples, and they would have sexual orgies and things of that nature. So sex was a very much part of these false religious systems. One of the things that they would do in that is they would take a cup and they would have it filled with wine and spices and other things, and it would create almost like a drug-induced state, and then there would be sexual acts that would take place as part of their worship and ritual type things. So that when it talks here about in her hand is a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities, it's very much matching the imagery of a false religious system that would have used this very kind of thing as part of their worship. And on her head was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes, and the earth's abominations. This is one of these things where there's a translation kind of issue. I was talking with this again yesterday with Brenda, and it becomes very confusing. So I want to help with that a little bit. You'll notice on here it says mystery, colon. I can never keep straight if that's colon or semicolon, but I think that's a colon. And then it starts a quote, Babylon, right? If you go to, here at the very top is ESV. That's what we're looking at is ESV. You'll see that's how it's listed at the very top. Name of mystery, colon, Babylon the Great. If you go to the King James or the modern King James, it does it differently. It says, and on her head was a name written, mystery, Babylon the Great. Mystery is actually, when you're looking at this, is part of her name. So I think the King James Version has their punctuation better. Mystery is part of the name of this woman. And so with that in mind, I'm asking you, why is the name mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and the earth's abomination? Why is that written on her forehead? And we'll answer that as we go, but it's important to connect mystery with Babylon the Great. Because if it's just Babylon the Great, that would be an easier thing to answer. But once you add mystery to it, it's like, so it's not Babylon? Why is this a mystery? So that I think that will help us as we move forward. So let's look at why is she called mystery Babylon the Great? What's going on there? And to do that, we're going to go back to Genesis 1. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. So they, Adam and Eve and their descendants, are to be fruitful, multiply, fill the whole earth, and subdue it. If you jump forward into Genesis chapter 9, this is post-flood. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. It's an exact same thing as he said to Adam and Eve. He's saying, hey, nothing's changed. I know you're back to now 8 and not, thousands. You're back to a very small number. You have the same task. You are to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the whole earth again with people. So then he goes on to talk, and I want to talk, this isn't connected to the morning, but I think it's an important thing, and I don't want to skip over it. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every bird of heaven, and upon everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Into your hands they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. So, just really quick, these animals have been with Noah and his sons and their wives on the ark, and there's not been this fear of man in them. God brought them in 2 by 2. They were like pets type thing, right? Docile and things of that nature. As soon as the flood ends, God puts fear into them because man is going to hunt them and kill them and eat them. So now for their protection, God has put fear in the hearts of animals as it relates to human beings. And so that's where that happened. I want you to see that. And then there in the middle, and as I gave you the green plants, I give you now everything. So prior to that, he'd given them plants to eat. Now he's given them everything to eat. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. So don't eat things that are alive. Don't eat things with the blood in them. For your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. You will hear of pushback in different quarters, and even from Christians, about capital punishment. And often we will go back to the Mosaic law to build the case for that. This way precedes the Mosaic law. And right here, God is establishing that if a man kills another man, by other men his life will be forfeited. So if I kill Bob, you guys have the responsibility to make sure that I die for that. Now, as governments are set up and established, and we get to Romans, it says, God has given that authority to government, and he's given them the sword, not a switch, not the rod like you use on a child, but a sword, because a sword is what you kill people with. So it is very appropriate for the government to enact what you see here, and again, that's been reiterated in the Mosaic Law, and then again in Romans. So we have it in 3 distinct different places and 3 different time periods that capital punishment is appropriate. And the reason is it is the only punishment that would be appropriate for the taking of life. If you do not take the life of that human who did that, you've devalued the life that was taken. It is this eye for eye, meaning proportional. It's not meant to make everybody blind, right? That's not the point of eye for eye. It means you don't take an arm when somebody lost an eye. It's an eye for an eye. There's proportionality is what's going on. There is nothing you can do in punishment that is appropriate other than to take the life of someone if they have taken a life. Not by accident, not manslaughter. God established things like cities of refuge for things like that, right? So that is being dealt with there. But this is establishing that, and its why is for God made man in his image. We are unique. We're not the highest level of animal, right? We are very unique in all of God's creation, and the life of that person is required if they kill someone. So I just wanted to not brush past that. Here at the verse 7, and you be fruitful and multiply, increase greatly on the earth and multiply in it. Same thing we saw with Adam and Eve. We saw it here at the beginning, and now we're seeing it here at the end of this. So I want you to establish in your mind their command is to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the whole earth. That's the point. So if you jump to the next chapter, it says, these are the generations of Noah, or the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Sons were born to them after the flood. I've shrunk down the text because I want to skip over it. It's just a series of so-and-so beget, so-and-so type things, of sons that we're not concerned with this morning. I'm not saying it's not important, it's just not relevant to what we're talking about. Verse 5 here, from these the coastal or coastland peoples spread in their lands, each with his own language, by their clans, in their nations. That's a reference to all these names that are listed in here. We'll come back to that. The sons of Ham, that's who we want to look at this morning. The sons of Ham is Cush, and then it lists more, Egypt, Put, Canaan. The sons of Cush, and he lists those. And then it says Cush fathered Nimrod. Nimrod is the guy we're interested in. So he's the grandson of Noah, great-grandson of Noah. Nimrod, who was the first on earth to be a mighty man, or a dominant, like world leader type thing. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. One thing about the word before, I did some checking on this. When it says before the Lord, it almost gives it a sense of he was a good guy, like he was before the Lord, right? But that's not what's being described there. It's used like 2,100 times, and it simply means in the face of, or in front of, or before. God sees what's happening is what's being described there. And he is in opposition to God, so I don't want the word before the Lord to be confusing as though he's a good guy, is my point. Therefore, it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. So that's a saying they had come up with because he was so mighty in the way that he established nations and things of that nature. Here in verse 10, the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and then it goes on to list several others, in the land of Shinar. So I want you to connect Babel and Shinar. Those two are important to understand as a connection. And he's a great-grandson of Noah. And Noah and his descendants have been told to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. And so this guy Nimrod establishes Babel. You go to the next chapter. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, right? And settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had bricks for stone and bitumen for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves." Why? "Lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." In direct opposition to what God had told them to do. He told them, "Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth." And they're saying, wait, we don't want to fill the earth. We want to stay right here. Let's build a big tall tower so that from a distance we can see it and always get back to this one place and not do what God told us to do. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And he said, and the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they all have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they purpose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down, and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore the name was called Babel, right? The city established by Nimrod. So Nimrod is the guy helping build this tower in the plain of Shinar, and because of what God does there, they end up calling it Babel, okay? Because there the Lord confused the languages of all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. So God is saying, I told you people to spread out. You're not listening, so I'm going to confuse your languages, and now you can't understand what he's saying and you're saying. So I want you to think about that in this room. Each of you each table represents a family. And over here, Mark and Brenda are not going to be given different languages. They're going to be given the same language. They're of the same family. God's not splitting families up. But when they speak, Ben has no clue what they're saying, and neither do any of the rest of you, right? So in clusters, in groups, remember this from earlier, verse 5, from these the coastland people spread in their lands, each with his own language, by their clans and in their nations. Each table took off in a different direction with a unique language and spread out over the earth. One of the reasons this matters, and I haven't forgotten, I'll come back. One of the reasons this matters is today we have this thing that we talk about called races of people. There's the black race, and there's the Hispanic race, or the Asian race, and that's all completely unbiblical. There are no races of people. There is a race of people. They're known as the descendants of Adam. And then they're known as the descendants of Noah, or, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. So they're all very similar when they're sitting in this room together at Babel, and they establish these religious practices of building these towers and things like that. God steps in and says, enough. You have a language, you have a language, you have a language, right? And they all start to scatter. So think about this. This is one of those things that we don't talk about enough. Adam and Eve have sons and daughters, and then it talks about their kids marrying. Well, it's always like, so who did they marry? Well, they married their sister, which is creepy, except for the fact that back then that wouldn't have been, because that's the only people around, right? So at that point at Noah, that's still not a bad thing. Genetically, they're very pure still. They're very close to the original perfect genetics. So that family group with a similar language can go off and marry cousins and things like that. But what's happened is they've isolated themselves genetically into a group. And so whatever's dominant in that group gets more and more dominant. And that which is peripheral eventually goes away. So this one group that migrates off this way ends up being sort of a yellowish type skin, somewhat like what we would think of as Asian, right? And then this other group has more pigment in their skin by just the genetic group that's there, and they become more of a brown or darker brown skinned people. And then this other group, they become more of a darker skinned people yet. Why? Because they're genetically being isolated from each other. It's all the same group. It's just that they've isolated down. Now, if you think about this with dogs, we do this all the time. There's 2 dogs. God creates dogs. And you can take, what Labradoodles didn't exist 10 years ago. Today they do, right? Or whatever it is. We do this all the time with dogs. We isolate, we take this trait or that trait. Finches, I think, is the one that the guy, what's his name? Darwin used. So if you have something in an environment that causes a trait to become not a good thing, that group dies out, and the one that is, if you have some with big beaks and some with small beaks, and the small beak guys can eat and the big beak guys can't, the big beak guys die out and the small beak, that's all that's left pretty soon, and then it looks like they've gone from this to this. It's just, it's narrowing in on what genetic traits are there that are able to be seen. So my point, or that will survive. So my point is, what you see happening here with the languages is accomplishing what God's purpose is, which is to spread them out over the face of the earth. It also is where we see races of people start to come together. I want to come back to this at some point, but I didn't want to skip over it this morning. It really isn't the point of the morning, but I don't want to not talk about it since we're at this section. Let me do this. Babel, that's that city, right? It later becomes known as Babylon. And today in Iraq, they are in the Saddam Hussein back in the 90s was in the process of rebuilding the city of Babylon. Well, there in that city is the ruins of the Tower of Babel. So why is that tied in with the stuff that we're talking about? Because when they had this false religious system that developed there with Nimrod at that city, which then became known as Babel, it is a false religious system. Babylon in Revelation is a false religious system. But it began at Babel, and as those different people groups start to spread, they take that false religious system with them. But similar to the way that races kind of came together with the genetics, that group over here, it sort of developed into this kind of a religion. And this one over here kind of developed into this sort of a religion. So all the religious systems of the world ultimately find their way back to Babel or Babylon. It's interesting, we're doing the Easter egg thing, right? Anybody ever wonder how we got Easter eggs with the resurrection? Any thought on that?
Especially with a rabbit.
And the rabbit? Yeah, any thought? Go ahead.
Well, I've studied that years ago. It's something about fertility, I believe, isn't it? And,
fertility,
It
God.
has nothing to do with the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Do you remember me talking about the prostitute and all the sexual stuff, fertility rights and all that? That's part of it. There's a bunch of false deities, Ishtar and others, Isis, and not the Arab thing we see today. It's spelled differently. But those things all find their way back to Babylon, actually. And they just keep getting migrated from place to place, and they keep moving out from there. Much of what you see in the Roman Catholic Church, some of their ceremonial things find their way all the way back to Babylon. And so what's happened is in Babel, and then it spread out from there, and Babylon, where they ended up back at, where they actually had the city of Babylon, the religious rites that happened there ended up getting moved around the world to all these different false religious systems. So when she's called the mother of prostitutes, it's like everything finds its roots there in Babylon or Babel. And the way it got dispersed into all these different kinds of religion is the same way we saw different ethnic groups. It's appropriate to call them people groups or ethnic groups, that's fine. But there aren't different races of people that are like distinct from each other. In fact, if you take, I remember this was in, and I've seen this or heard it talked about numerous times in different sources that are like scientific sources. There's a greater degree of difference between, say, me and Mark Arns genetically than there would be between, say, me and someone who is what we would call black in certain ways of measuring that. So we are really of a single race, and what the difference is primarily cultural differences or different genetic things have elevated up where others things have been repressed. So it's that we are a single race. We are all of one family, and that's very much a biblical concept that would be very good if the world could get their head around that these days, right? So the answer to this question, why is Mystery Babylon, the great mother of prostitutes and the earth's abomination, why is that written on her forehead? Babylon the Great is the false religious system that began at Babel and is the mother for all false religions. And it's a mystery because it's more than just the actual city Babylon. So, and that will make more sense as we move through this. But so it's associating it with the city called Babylon, but it's not isolated to just the city Babylon. That's why it's Mystery Babylon. It's more than that. And it's the mother of prostitutes because it is the mother of all false religious systems. So why are the kings of the earth and the dwellers on the earth said to have committed sexual immorality with her? Why is that imagery being used here? And I have this one just to show you that it's not only here, but it's on down later where it talks about holding in her hand the cup of, in her hand a golden cup full of abomination and impurities, sexual immorality, the mother of prostitutes. This idea runs all the way through. And I just remembered, I was going to come back to you. Sorry, go. What was your point?
It
Question.
was several slides back.
Yes.
About the one about Babel. In something in the verse I didn't understand. Yeah, right there.
Okay.
Verse 7.
Let us
us go down
and confuse them. Yep.
Meaning us, meaning the Trinity.
Trinity, right.
Trinity.
Yep.
Let us go down and confuse their language. No. Above that.
Oh,
And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them.
right. In other words, human beings, given the opportunity with the ingenuity that God has hardwired into them, right? We're made in His image. We can do just incredible things. He doesn't want that to happen right then. So in confusing them, they're all pitted against each other because of their divisive language.
Oh, like, all right. So
Yeah.
things that we're doing now, He didn't want us to do.
Yeah, so what's interesting is we now have, the universal translator of Star Trek, right? It's called Google. And it's funny, but I literally in the business I do, I can at times go to somebody's house and they're from Croatia. Well, I don't know Croatian, but Google Translator does. And so I can pull up an app and hit the button and say, hello, my name's, and I'm here for da-da-da-da, and then I hit the button for Croatian and it says it for me. It's crazy. My point is, you have scientists that are on different parts of the globe that don't speak the same language. They're helping each other accomplish tasks because there's no issue with translation anymore. We're literally pre-Babel right now in terms of language. And are we doing things like what he just described here? There's nothing that's impossible for them. We're doing all kinds of impossible things, or things that were thought to be impossible. So yeah, that I do think that's what that's referencing. Sorry I didn't come back to you sooner. So I just wanted you to see that the fact that this idea of sexual immorality is all through it. We've seen these before, so I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on it, but the whole book of Hosea really lays this out well. Ezekiel 16, I've read it in here before. I'm not going to do a lot of that today. I'm going to just read one short section, but I would really encourage you, if you haven't read it, go read Ezekiel 16. It's kind of amazing. It says, "And after all your wickedness, woe, woe to you, declares the Lord God. You built yourself a vaulted chamber and made yourself a lofty place in every square. At the head of every street you built your lofty place and made your beauty an abomination, offering yourself to any passerby and multiplying your whoring. You also played the whore with the Egyptians, your lustful neighbors, multiplying your whoring to provoke me to anger." So he's talking about the nation Israel and the worship of false gods. But he uses this analogy of the wife, or the nation of Israel, the wife, in this worshiping false gods, and he uses the analogy of an adulterous wife as that analogy. I thought about that, and it's like, I'm not surprised at it, but just the genius of God. I don't think he could use any more powerful analogy to help us get what idolatry looks like or feels like. I hope that none of you have to go through that, and some of you, I'm sure, probably have faced that adultery in your, by your spouse or something to that effect. But I just cannot imagine anything more painful than that. And God chooses that to say that's what this feels like when you turn your affection to somebody else. And he uses it all through the scripture. And then you read Ezekiel 16 and then think about turning your affection to something other than God, and it's hair-raising. It is. So why is that way? Because God uses sexual immorality to illustrate how bad idolatry is throughout the Bible. At the end, idolatry is rampant, and it has been used to unite the world. Satan uses this idolatrous system, this Babylonian false religious system, to unite the world. We studied him a while back, called the false prophet. He's the leader of this false religious system, the coming together of all the separate Babylonian based faiths or religious systems. Yeah, I gotta leave that there for a bit. It's long.
Question?
Yep.
The difference between the kings of the earth and the dwellers of the earth, the kings of the earth would symbolize the state religions.
I would think it's actually more like the actual leaders at that time, the actual, like, the governmental leaders of that time. So, like, we'll see that there are 10 kings that are like under authority to the Antichrist. They run 10 regions of the world. So what I think is actually being described there is they're using this false religious system, this one world global faith, to unite all these different disparate groups of people from around the world. And so that's why there's this and the kings of the earth are using false religious systems to gain power, type thing. And then the people who dwell on the earth are the ones actively involved in this false religious system, and therefore they're committing this sexual immorality, meaning they're participating in this false religious system. So the kings are using it to their advantage, and the people are participating in it. Yeah.
So that's what's going on then with abortion today? It's more become a religion to these people?
Well,
Why there's so much?
which is a
war?
whole nother thing, which is interesting, but yes, I mean, it's child sacrifice, right? Not to screw up all of your holidays, but right, so we've just thrown out Easter eggs because they're, and the Yule log is the burning of, at Christmas is the burning, maybe I'll try to get into that some next week or something, but it's a Babylonian tradition. You'd burn the log, and then the next morning, there was a tree, and it was this new life coming out of death, and it's an ancient pagan tradition. You ever thought about why do we have Christmas trees, right? Why do we? Where's the Yule log? Where's that come from? Easter eggs, bunnies, blah blah blah. All these symbol things that we just do. Well, why do we do those? Because they're all find their way back to Babylon and the false religious system of Babylon. Now, does that mean you can't have a Christmas tree? No, I think we'll probably still have one. Why? Because for us, it's not that. It's about nostalgia and family memories and all those things. So we sort of redeem that, I think, by bringing good meaning to it. But anyway, it is something to be aware of. Go ahead.
And I think the overall thing is the seeming attractiveness of one world government, and how our governmental leaders have and are even preaching that now. And I don't get it, and maybe it's because I'm a Christian, but there seems to be this attractiveness for the global government, and to have one leader, why other leaders would want to, but that's the way. It's amazing how what's actually happening.
Yeah, it is actually.
The world is trying to do matches this almost, well, not almost perfectly.
Yeah. By the way, this is one you're going to want to start writing down. It's the next thing, and it's going to have to be up there a while because it's long. Who or what is the great prostitute? It's the false religious system of the world that began at Babel and is the mother for all false religion. It will eventually reunite all religions into a unified global false religious system. That is like a mouthful. Very first question on the sheet is, what is the great prostitute? So here's the point I want to make. Why there's this desire to have one religion or one government. On the face of it, it makes a lot of sense, because if you have two nations, they want to fight each other. So if you only have one, there's no one to fight, right? If you have, Islam and Jews, and they keep shooting rockets at each other, how many lives could be saved if they could just be of the same faith and they wouldn't have to kill each other off, right? Or the Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, right? There's a lot of common sense that says, look, if we could just unite all the faiths of the world into one faith, we'd quit killing each other. If we could get all the governments of the world to come together in one government, then there wouldn't be war anymore, because who are you going to fight? They're all one thing, right? That's the logic of it. Now, why does that not work? It's because...
What do you believe?
What?
What do you believe?
Well, if you believe a false religious system, what's the difference between this false religious system and that? They're all very similar when you strip it all away, in that they are all about, I have to do this. Now, they may think they have to do different things, but they're all about doing things to get on the right side of God, right? Mm-hmm. That's the common trait of all false religious systems. Now, is that going to come together easily? No, I don't think that it will. But eventually it does actually come together. We know that it does because the Revelation tells us that there is a single false religious system at the end. But the common traits that they hold are actually pretty interesting to see. Here's again the other thing. Satan, there aren't actually 10 different deities being worshipped in the world. There's actually one true God, and then there's Satan. And all the false religious systems are a version of worshiping Satan, posing as fill in the blank, right? A god of whatever kind. And so when they become enlightened to the point of saying, this was the path to, and they figure out what that ultimate God is, they may not realize him to be Satan, but that they all do come together. That's what is happening. That's what's being described here. How that will happen, I don't know. How does the Hindu and the Muslim come together? I don't know how that happens. Go ahead.
When the Antichrist sits in the temple and proclaims that he is God,
Yeah.
he will, society at that time will have to worship him or be executed. So he will form maybe a new religion combining all this together, possibly?
Yeah. If I had not run out of time, we would have gotten there this morning, but instead we'll get there next week. Let me give you this. This does come together, and it may be disparate, and you have a lot of people around the earth being resistant to that, but there is this one false religious system that unifies the world, and the and a one world government under the Antichrist. And then halfway through, he switches it up and says, no, don't worship that false religious system. I'm God. And he just sets himself up to be God. And so that we'll look at next time, just because we don't have time to look at it this morning, but I wanted to. That's where that all ends up leading to. So it goes from many religions to one, and then the one shifts focus and is at Antichrist, which is ultimately at Satan, because it says they worship the dragon, which is Satan. All right, let me do this as I wrap this up. What is the difference between all false religions and biblical Christianity? What is the difference? Let's look at this verse. This doesn't answer that, but I think it's a helpful thing to see. The Lord passed before him being Moses, and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. That is an incredibly gracious, loving God, right? That's great. We love that. But who will by no means clear the guilty. So because we're all guilty, none of us get to enjoy that. Because he's very clear. I'm not going to clear the guilty. If you're guilty, you will receive judgment. So he's going to be merciful and gracious and forgiving and steadfast love for thousands, unless you're guilty. So if you put that together, that creates sort of a conundrum, right? It's like, so how does that work? If you're not going to clear the guilty and yet you're going to forgive sin and transgression, or not, how does that work? They don't know that for a long time. They have this, sacrificial system and all of that. Eventually what we realize is God sends himself, Jesus, and that's who he lays all the guilt on. That's who he by no means clears the guilty. No, Jesus takes all that punishment and wrath, satisfying God's wrath, and then allowing us to be forgiven and have his steadfast love. So what's the difference between all false religious systems and biblical Christianity? All false religions require you to do. It's all about you doing things to make yourself right with God. Biblical Christianity says done. That's the difference. It's about doing, or it's about he's already done that. Jesus took God's wrath by dying and reconciled us through resurrection. Through faith alone, we are given his righteousness purely by his loving grace. It is such a different thing than all other religions. And it's why true Christianity will never be part of that false religious system. And it is in part why they are killing all the Christians during that time frame. They're the resistant ones. They're the ones saying, no, but Jesus said no one comes to the Father but by me. Right? Off at the head. Shut up, we don't want to hear that. So all these other religions are variations of I got to do this or do that. So it would be much easier for all of them to come back together. And we simply never will, because it goes completely counter to biblical Christianity. I know I got to end. We're out of time. I got through maybe a third of it. That was not too bad. All right. Let me pray, and I'll leave that up for you guys. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the morning. Thank you for all the ways that you bless us by having all these truths right there in your scripture that you've given us, the revealed Word of God. There are so many answers to so many questions that the world needs answered, but they refuse to look at where the truth is. So Lord, we pray that you would help us to dig and find and have these answers, but also to be able to share those answers with others. Not just about things like race and origins of the universe and all of those things, but about what we just ended with, which is, it's not about doing, but it's about the fact that you've already done it all. Help us to have boldness as we share that truth, and we pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.